Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation.
The carbon tax has become just another vehicle for redistributing wealth. It's a form of socialism masquerading as environmentalism.
What would happen to the parties had to fight a double dissolution on this issue?
The party would be, look, we would be wiped out. This would be
You know, such political future as I have got rests entirely on beating this tax. Beating it in the Parliament if I can, but beating it in the electorate if I can't beat it in the Parliament. So that's the whole purpose of what's left of my political life, to do this.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. What we will do...
Now, I cannot promise victory. Obviously, this is going to be very tough, but I can promise a contest. It will be a good contest, it will be a clean contest, and I know my colleagues are gearing up for the fight of their life. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for coming. It's great to be here. It's been a tumultuous week for the Liberal Party. Obviously, it's been a big day for me. It's been a tough day for some of my colleagues. I do feel humbled and daunted by what's ahead, but I also feel proud and exhilarated at the prospect of leading this great political party into the next election. Now, this emissions trading scheme legislation, which is really an energy taxation scheme, does deserve the most rigorous scrutiny by this Parliament. This is a $120 billion tax on the Australian public, and that is just for starters. Oppositions are not there to get legislation through. Oppositions are there to hold the government to account. And unless we are confident that a piece of legislation is beyond reasonable doubt in the national interest, it is our duty as the opposition to vote it down. Now, as leader, I am not frightened of an election, and I am not frightened of an election on this issue. I really am not frightened of an election on this issue because, as far as many, many millions of Australians are concerned, what the Rudd government ETS looks like is a great big tax to create a great big slush fund to provide politicised handouts run by a giant bureaucracy. And they expect us to scrutinise and to criticise this, not just to wave it through the Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a tough fight, but it will be a fight. You cannot win an election without a fight. The job of the opposition is to be an alternative, not an echo, to provide a choice, not a copy. Now, I cannot promise victory. Obviously, this is going to be very tough, but I can promise a contest. It will be a good contest, it will be a clean contest, and I know my colleagues are gearing up for the fight of their lives.
Mr Abbott, are you saying that...
Julie, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Tony. I want to congratulate my colleague Tony Abbott on being elected as the leader of the great Liberal Party. He is a personality, a character, a fighter, and I am honoured to be able to serve as his deputy. And as Tony said, we will have a contest at the next election, whenever that may be. And as I have said from the outset, there was no need, no logical reason for this legislation to be rammed through the Parliament prior to Copenhagen.
You were quoted a month or so ago as saying that climate change is crap. Do you still believe that? Do you still believe that?
Look, it was a bit of hyperbole. It's not my considered position. One more question, last question.
Do you hope you can take the Nats with you in your quest? Do you hope you can take the Nationals with you in your quest for a new climate change policy?
Well, look, it's very important that we remain a united coalition. I have always been a very strong supporter of the coalition. I've always thought that a Liberal was a city national and a national is a country Liberal. I mean, I think that it's very important that this coalition stays together. The Conservative side of politics will not flourish if we do not have a strong and effective coalition, and I'm looking forward to a good relationship with Warren Truss and his team. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Senator Bernardi.
I have an inconvenient truth for Labor, and I have some words of hope for the Australian people. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, upon whose report Labor have based and justified their ETS, or their great green tax as the Australian public has come to know it, is built as a house of cards. It is built on rent-seeking, on dodgy science, on intimidation and alarmism, all the characteristics of which the Labor Party have used in trying to justify their emissions trading scheme. But the only conclusion a sensible-minded person can come to, that when you've got a policy that is built on such dodgy foundations, the policy response itself is dodgy, it is flawed, and the Australian public is waking up to the fact that Labor's ETS is hopelessly and horribly flawed. But here are some of the reasons why the IPCC report is flawed and dodgy. Labor have repeated some of them today. Senator McLucas and Senator Cameron, the dinosaurs of the climate change movement, are looking back at stuff that has been discredited and using it to justify their increasingly discredited arguments. Firstly, Himalayan glaciers, they were meant to melt by 2035. False. Proved false. Another dodgy thing that we've heard repeated today. We haven't heard that 40% of the Amazon rainforest was going to disappear, because that's false too, but they probably didn't have time to remark on it. The hockey stick graph proved to be built on false and fraudulent data. The claim of wild weather and increasing cyclonic activity. Senator McLucas talked about that today. Built on, once again, it's wrong. It's been proved wrong, but it's repeated by the dinosaurs in the Labor Party. The information they are relying on has not been peer-reviewed. It has been taken from World Wildlife Fund journals, from Greenpeace journals. Some German exchange student put it in his report, and that was produced as fact in the IPCC. And these are all used by the Labor Party to justify their great green tax.
Well, the Liberals' change of leadership has achieved exactly what the people behind it wanted. After more than 50 hours of debate, the Rudd government's emissions trading scheme has been scuttled by the Senate. Tony Abbott's rise to the top diminished the number of Liberal senators who'd been expected to support the policy, down from a dozen to just 2. The Senate rejection has delivered the government the trigger it needs to dissolve both houses of Parliament and call an election. But the government is in no hurry, pledging instead to bring the legislation back next year for a third attempt to pass it. Dana Robertson reports from Canberra.
As the clock ticked down, the debate fired up.
We have seen the hijacking of the future, the hijacking of the national interest by extremists.
Bring it on. Bring it on. We will have the fight. We will have the fight, because we will say to the Australian public, it is quite simple. If you don't understand this tax, do not vote for it.
And by close of business, they were still in full flight.
The sitting of the Senate is suspended till 10 a.m. tomorrow.
A night's rest tempered their passion.
The CPRS is dead, and no amount of CPR will revive it.
We will not take a backward step. Mr President, I commend the bills to the chamber.
But the Liberals' week-long leadership spectacle achieved one thing at least.
It's going to take a while to adjust to it.
The centrepiece legislation of the Rudd government's first term went out with a whimper, thanks to an unlikely coalition who almost all disagreed with each other.
Question is, the bill be now read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. Against say no. There being 33 ayes, 41 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative.
In the end, 2 Liberal senators defied their new leader to cross the floor.
OK, well now to tonight's guest, the new leader of the Liberal Party, Tony Abbott. He's taken on the job with the opposition travelling poorly in the polls and a big task ahead, reuniting the party. Tony Abbott, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Tony. Almost no one was more surprised than I was at the turn events had taken. I mean, the last thing I would have imagined in the last parliamentary sitting week was that within a week I would find myself as leader. Well, if we win the election, I'll be regarded as a genius. If we don't win, I'll probably be a political roadkill. The Tony Abbott Cancer Centre in Darwin, Mr. Speaker. The leader of the opposition comes into this parliament and puts his hand in his heart and boasts about the pet scanner at Royal North Shore Hospital. I promise that money, Mr. Speaker. I promise that money.
Welcome to the program, and today was a day when the Prime Minister's words came back to haunt him big time. Late last year, when the opposition was demanding a delay in the government's emissions trading scheme until after the Copenhagen summit, Kevin Rudd accused them of absolute political cowardice and an absolute failure of leadership. He also described climate change as the greatest moral, economic and environmental challenge of our generation. Now he has postponed the ETS for 3 years at least, and what was once a central plank in Labor's first-term agenda is now at the bottom of the pile. Political editor Chris Uhlmann.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation. To delay any longer would be reckless and irresponsible for our economy and for our environment.
The fact is, the longer we delay our response to climate change, the harder our job will become and the more it will cost. We cannot run and we cannot hide.
We confront the great moral, economic and environmental challenge of our generation.
That's now a very inconvenient truth.
The implementation of a carbon pollution reduction scheme in Australia will therefore be extended until after the conclusion of the current Kyoto commitment period, which finishes at the end of 2012.
The government's put plans for an emissions trading scheme on ice that was to be the centrepiece of its response to climate change. Part of the argument for raising the white flag is that the emissions trading bill cannot clear the hurdle of the Senate, where the opposition, the Greens and the Independents have twice voted it down.
The opposition decided to backflip on its historical commitment to bringing in a carbon pollution reduction scheme, and there's been slow progress in the realisation of global action on climate change. These two factors together inevitably mean that the implementation of a carbon pollution reduction scheme in Australia will be delayed.
But if the Prime Minister really wanted an emissions trading scheme, he could have it this year. He could use the fact that his bill has twice been rejected by the Senate to ask the Governor-General to dissolve both houses of Parliament. If he won the election, then his bill would pass in a joint sitting of those houses.
Mr Rudd has a challenge on his hands. Why has he run away from what he said was the greatest moral challenge of our time?
The other argument for delay is that Australia needs to wait and see what the rest of the world does when the Kyoto Agreement expires in 2012.
And that will provide, therefore, the Australian government at that time, at the end of 2012, with a better position to assess the level of global action on climate change prior to the implementation of a CPRS in Australia.
That's also a tough case to muster in the wake of a blistering attack the Prime Minister launched last year. Then he ridiculed those who dared suggest waiting even a few months for the outcome of the Copenhagen Climate Conference.
What absolute political cowardice. What absolute failure of leadership. What absolute failure of logic.
The inescapable logic of this approach is that if every nation makes the decision not to act until others have done so, then no nation will ever act.
So, given there is no practical argument for delay, there must be a political argument.
Just simply is not going to take action because the big end of town doesn't want it. Well, the Australian people do.
But perhaps the government's going cold on emissions trading because its polling shows the electorate's cooling on global warming. What was a huge political positive in 2006 is becoming a liability. Since 2006, the Lowy Institute has conducted a yearly poll which asks whether Australians should take action on climate change, even if it involves significant costs. 68% of those polled agreed with that proposition in 2006. That's now down to 46%.
I think back in 2006, 2007, when we were polling, there was a combination of factors. There was the Al Gore movie, there was the Stern Review, there was wide-ranging drought and fires and so on, and people, I think, had started to make the connection between climate change and some of these natural disasters that were happening. I think roll forward a few years, you've got the problems with the Copenhagen climate change talks, you've got some doubts raised about the science around climate change, and the fact that the drought's no longer with us.
For 9 long, dry years, the drought is officially over, and while farming families prepare for a bumper crop, city dwellers could also reap some rewards.
Somewhere in that crop are Paul and Alicia Moon's children. These are the sounds of good times.
I love these.
Finally, bumper crops after almost a decade of drought.
It's the best rain that's been seen in some areas in almost a decade, when drought began to take hold. Bare paddocks that were being scoured by dust storms just 3 days ago are now covered by soaking rain. What a change.
And could you find your way to the rain gauge, Scott?
Yeah, I remembered where it was, but yeah, no, it's good to have to go and measure it every day.
Action on climate change was a totemic part of the argument for the future that Kevin Rudd campaigned on in 2007. His first act as Prime Minister was to ratify the Kyoto Agreement to the applause of the world. The government used climate change as a club to bludgeon the opposition for 2 years, and it beat 2 opposition leaders to death. Brendan Nelson was killed off for arguing for delay, Malcolm Turnbull for desperately trying to meet the government's December deadline.
A major political party must have a credible policy on climate change.
There is another benefit in abandoning emissions trading. Over the next 4 years, compensation associated with the scheme was estimated to cost the budget $2.7 billion. Now that money can be saved, going halfway to offsetting the $5 billion the Prime Minister just spent cobbling together his health deal with the states. And health is the issue Kevin Rudd wants to campaign on. Today he went out hard against the coalition for blocking another part of his agenda in the Senate, means testing the private health insurance rebate.
It's reckless, it's irresponsible, it's opposition for opposition's sake, and this measure should be passed, should be allowed to pass in order to deliver more hospital beds, more doctors, more nurses for working families, pensioners and carers everywhere.
The health insurance bill is another double dissolution trigger, and that early election gun could be fired as late as August 10, which would mean a September election. But then if the government does call a double dissolution, how can it argue that it shouldn't also fight that election on its climate change bill?
What was the greatest moral challenge last year has become the greatest inconvenience this year.
It's hard to see how the government can walk back from its myriad bold statements on the desperate need for putting a price on carbon without damaging its credibility, especially if it calls an early poll based on the repeated rejection of its private health insurance bill. If you really believe that climate change is the greatest moral and economic challenge of our age, then you wouldn't retreat, would you? Because if you did, people might begin to wonder what you actually believe in.
Well, effectively, Kevin Rudd's part of a cascade which goes back to Tony Abbott and to the sceptics in the Liberal Party and the National Party. Tony Abbott backed off.
He's put a torpedo into the arrangement between Kevin Rudd and the coalition, and now Kevin Rudd's following suit and backing off. And the problem here is that Kevin Rudd was prepared to negotiate with the coalition on climate change, but hasn't been prepared to negotiate with the Greens.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr Speaker, I am delighted to talk about health and hospital policy in this parliament, because the first thing I'll say about it is that members opposite, members of this government, should stop telling lies about the record of the Howard government.
Order. The Leader of the House resuming seat. The Leader of the House resuming. The Leader of the Opposition will withdraw.
Well, Mr Speaker, I withdraw and I say they should stop telling grotesque untruths about the record of the Howard government in every single year between 1996 and 2007. Health and hospital funding in this country from the federal government went up and went up massively. Mr Speaker, we brought allied health professionals into the Medicare net for the first time. The Prime Minister came into this parliament today, puts his hand on his heart and boasts about the opening of a new cancer centre in Darwin. I provided that money, Mr Speaker, in 2007. It ought to be called the Tony Abbott Cancer Centre in Darwin, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition comes into this parliament and puts his hand in his heart and boasts about the PET scanner at Royal North Shore Hospital. I promised that money, Mr Speaker. I promised that money. It ought to be called the Tony Abbott PET scanner at Royal North Shore Hospital. Now, Mr Speaker, the more they squeal, the more their embarrassment shows. The Prime Minister comes in and talks about insulin pumps. I provided the funding for insulin pumps. What a fraud! What a phony! What a complete fake this Prime Minister is! What a disgrace to the great office of the Prime Ministership of this country that this man is. Now, Mr Speaker,
of 2 years building up your political capital, how have you managed to damage brand Rudd so comprehensively in such a short time this year?
Obviously, a whole lot of people in the community have been disappointed by the position I announced in relation to the future of the carbon pollution reduction scheme. What's the reality that I had to confront there? Well, two realities. One is that the Liberal Party backflipped and voted our legislation down, having negotiated an agreement with Mr Turnbull to get it through. That is the reality we had to confront. And the second reality is this, that when we got to Copenhagen, it didn't produce the sort of progress on the global agenda that we all had hoped. Therefore, where do we go to from here? Our commitment on climate change hasn't changed one bit. It's happening. Now, hang on, let me finish. You've asked me a pretty fundamental question here, which is about how the actions which I'm responsible for and the government's responsible for are being seen. On the question of climate change, our view hasn't changed one bit. The greenhouse gas reduction targets remain the same. Our commitment to a carbon pollution reduction scheme is the best way of getting there is the same. But we cannot alter the fact that the Liberal Party has voted this down in the Senate.
OK, but there's one thing that you cannot escape, and that is this. It is still in your hands to go to the next election on the issue that you defined as a great moral challenge of our time, an issue on which you accuse the opposition of absolute political cowardice. It is in your hands to go to the next election, seek a double dissolution, whether you seek a double dissolution or not, and make this ETS a fresh mandate for the people to decide and tell both sides of politics what they want. Now, you have squibbed that decision. You have put this on the back burner until 2013 at least, and the budget makes that clear.
In the meantime, what we will do...
Mr Rudd, when the opposition tried to argue with you on holding back a vote on the ETS until after Copenhagen, that is, until after the world had made a stand, you said that was absolute political cowardice. So why is it not now absolute political cowardice for you to show leadership on this to the rest of the world by seeking to take the Australian people with you at the next election on an ETS?
You know something, Kerry, where I think you've got this fundamentally wrong is, frankly, being absent from the negotiations in Copenhagen themselves. There was no government in the world, like the Australian government, which threw its every energy at bringing about a deal, a global deal on climate change. Penny Wong and I sat up for 3 days and 3 nights with 20 leaders from around the world to try and frame a global agreement. Now, it might be easy for you to sit and 7:30 report land and say that was easy to do. Let me tell you, mate, it wasn't.
Well, you've got a lean and hungry look back there. Is it? Haven't you? Old Billy? No, we don't know you, mate. We know you. I'm on Kevin's side. I've always been on his side. Hello, no, I'm on his side. We're all on his side. I know it's sunrise. I know. I give in. I have a soft spot for the member for Griffith. Unlike the Assistant Treasurer, I do have a soft spot for him. He's a good man. Just keep your hands just well displayed there, Bill. Keep them up. Keep them above the table. We don't know what you've got in your holster, old son, but we can only guess. That's right. He's the one that has to go through the metal detector on the way into Parliament. That's there. That's okay. So, that's right. Yeah, that's right. You've got to be careful of the smiley ones. And I tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm having a great time taking out on this guy.
In breaking news tonight, there are leadership rumblings within the Rudd government. The ABC has learnt that senior ministers and factional power brokers are in talks and counting numbers for a potential move against Kevin Rudd. Let's go to Canberra now. Here's our chief political correspondent, Mark Simkin.
The rumblings within the Labor Party are getting louder tonight. Several government sources have told the ABC that MPs are being sounded out about a possible move against the Prime Minister. Ministers have been asked for their support, and the push is apparently coming from Victoria. It isn't a challenge, though, because there isn't a challenger. The sources say Julia Gillard has not thrown her hat into the ring. Now, the timing is critical here. Tomorrow is the last sitting day before the long winter break, and on Friday, Kevin Rudd is due to fly to Toronto, Canada, for the G20 meeting. What the ABC can confirm, though, is that senior figures within the government, key figures within the government, are openly questioning the Prime Minister's position and authority.
Good evening, I'm Sandra Sully and welcome to this special edition of 10's Late News. Tonight there is political history in the making. Julia Gillard will challenge Kevin Rudd to become the first female Prime Minister of Australia. Let's cross to Paul Bongiorno in Canberra. And Paul, Kevin Rudd says he's confident and he's defiant ahead of tomorrow's special caucus meeting.
Yes, Sandra, just 2.5 years ago, Kevin Rudd was the most popular Prime Minister Australia had ever had. But tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, in a specially convened caucus meeting, he will face his judgment day. Some are saying it'll be his execution. That vote will be between him and his deputy. One piece of gossip, I suppose you could say, going the rounds is that Julia Gillard walked into the office at 7:30 tonight and told Kevin Rudd to go quietly or she'd challenge him. The Prime Minister said she asked for a challenge. He's agreed to it to clear the air, but as you say, he's defiant.
I was elected by the people of Australia to do a job. I was not elected by the factional leaders of Australia, of the Australian Labor Party, to do a job, though they may be seeking to do a job on me. That's a separate matter.
Thank you. Can I confirm I will be a candidate in tomorrow's ballot, and apart from that statement, I haven't got any other statement at this time.
Do you believe you can win the Prime Minister?
Thank you.
Do you believe you can win this, Gillard?
Well, two of the last two that you mentioned are from Victoria. Bill Shorten, of course, was the head of the AWU, the big right-wing union that tonight, as we'll hear, has come out in support of Julia Gillard. And Mark Habib, of course, from the New South Wales right. He was ironically the power broker that helped install Kevin Rudd as leader of the Labor Party.
Julia Gillard has become Australia's first female Prime Minister after Kevin Rudd stood down as Labor Party leader this morning.
As returning officer of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, I wish to report to you that the new leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, elected unopposed, is Julia Gillard. The new deputy leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, elected unopposed, is Wayne Swan.
Miss Gillard, flanked by her new deputy Wayne Swan, told an overflowing caucus room that she was truly honoured to be given the country's top job.
And can I say, Australians one and all, it's with the greatest humility, resolve and enthusiasm that I sought the endorsement of my colleagues to be the Labor leader and to be the Prime Minister of this country.
I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you that this has been a very busy 2.5 years. We have thrown our absolute all at this. Now, for the future, I will be dedicating my every effort to ensure the re-election of this Australian Labor government.
Amid the jubilant scenes of Kevin Rudd's landslide election victory back in 2007, nobody could imagine that he wouldn't even last one full term. But now, less than 3 years after he was elected, a man who was once Australia's most popular Prime Minister ever has been tossed out of the job.
Now, I cannot promise victory. Obviously, this is going to be very tough, but I can promise a contest. It will be a good contest, it will be a clean contest, and I know my colleagues are gearing up for the fight of their lives.
Rudd would later concede that not calling an election was a mistake. It cost him his leadership.
Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Laurie.
And congratulations, of course.
Thank you very much.
But I've got to ask you the question Richard Carlton famously asked Bob Hawke. How does it feel to have blood on your hands?
Well, Laurie, and my answer will be, I was a loyal deputy. I came to a decision about what was in the best interests of the nation to get the government back on track. I obviously stand by that decision. It's my decision.
The Prime Minister is expected to launch Labor's new climate change policy tomorrow, but don't expect it to include a price on carbon. 10's Hugh Rimmington is in Canberra. Hugh, this is the third of the big policy areas Julia Gillard said she wanted to get in shape. So what should we expect?
That's right, Sandra. You might remember the very day she became Prime Minister, Julia Gillard nominated 3 areas she wanted to nail down. They were the mining tax row, border protection and climate change. Well, the mining tax row is certainly not over. Threats today of a new ad campaign from the miners. Border protection, the regional processing centre is still very much a work in progress. As for climate change, Julia Gillard is now promising, she has been promising, to look for a community consensus. So this means no price on carbon pollution at least until 2013. On who's best to lead Labor, Julia Gillard rates 52% to Kevin Rudd's 21%. Tony Abbott could only wish for figures like that. With Malcolm Turnbull still favoured to lead the Liberals, Mr Abbott ties for second with Joe Hockey. Even worse for Tony Abbott, this Morgan poll is consistent with all other recent published polls. In a head-to-head race, Julia Gillard is leading Tony Abbott as preferred Prime Minister by a margin of 2-1. The Liberal leader will have much riding on Sunday's election debate. Meanwhile, the government is tipped to shift the focus with the release tomorrow of its new position on climate change.
Okay, well look, thanks everyone for coming along today. It's good to see that there is a little bit of interest in this announcement. It's nice to see such a big roll-up.
The documents are being distributed, so you'll be able to peruse them obviously at your leisure. But our policy will deliver the same emissions reductions as the government's, but without the government's great big new tax.
Coal and oil have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Coal and oil have got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho!
It wasn't quite the welcome Julia Gillard might have hoped for as she attempted to offer her solution to climate policy, or lack of it.
Hey, Julia! Something must be done!
She may well be ruining her choice of venue at the University of Queensland for one of the key speeches of her campaign, aimed at silencing critics over the dumped ETS.
Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Fossil fuels have got to go! Hey, hey!
One protester was arrested midway through the speech. But the show went on, as the Prime Minister borrowed the time-honoured tradition of one of her predecessors, Bob Hawke.
We need consensus among political parties, but we need consensus in the community even more.
And here came the punchline as she declared that ordinary Australians, whoever they are, would be brought into the process.
And so today I announce that if we are re-elected, I will deliver a dedicated process, a citizens' assembly, to examine over 12 months the evidence on climate change.
Julia Gillard has bought herself time on an issue that had to be addressed somehow in this campaign, since she'd ruled out action on a carbon price until at least 2012. Her opponents, though, say they can see through the strategy.
Let me be very clear. This is camouflage for the coming climate tax.
How do you randomly select people? What, is walk along the street, tap people on the shoulder and say, congratulations, you won a prize, you to determine our climate policy?
The Prime Minister insists she'll lead the debate and will act when the economy and the community are ready. Who knows when that might be? Julia Gillard was a leading member of the Gang of Four who scrapped the ETS in the first place and is acutely aware of the backlash that created.
The lesson I've learned from that is that we need more than a fragile political consensus to deal with such a transformation to the way we live and work. This is about the Australian people.
Her speech today appears to have appeased the business community, but not leading environmental groups.
It is good the Prime Minister's going to lead a debate, but the majority of Australians do support action right now.
Whilst there are some differences of approach between the two parties, what they are both essentially now saying is that Australia needs to get both the detail and timing right in respect of climate change policy. That's much better than where we were 12 months ago, where we were all running like lemmings towards the edge of a cliff with an emissions trading system before the rest of the world was prepared to do so.
For the federal opposition, this is no time for bipartisanship. For Tony Abbott, there's just one target.
It's high time that the Prime Minister show some real leadership on this, not fudge the issue until after the election. It's not good enough. And as things stand, Julia Gillard looks very much like the man she deposed, Kevin Rudd. How can you trust them to deliver on their 2010 promises when they completely reneged on their 2007 promises? There will be no carbon price on consumers under a coalition government.
That will disappoint some of his own party and these climate-sensitive protesters. The campaign's first opinion poll could also cause a few chills. Tony Abbott's a long way behind as preferred Prime Minister. And while Labor's primary vote is below the 40% threshold, once the Greens' preferences are distributed, the government takes an election-winning lead.
Good evening and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra for the 2010 Election Leaders Debate. Please make welcome Prime Minister Julia Gillard and Opposition Leader Tony Abbott. Next question comes from Chris Hillman.
Ms Gillard, Australia is committed to a target of 5% reduction in carbon emissions by 2020, and you're committed to putting on a carbon price. How long can we go before we reach the point of no return? And what year will we get to where Australia can't meet that cut because you've delayed too long? And you yourself said last year, to delay is to deny.
Chris, I'm an optimist. And I believe we can work our way to a community consensus about putting a cap on carbon pollution and designing the market-based mechanism that will support that. Now, we had a consensus in Parliament House, and obviously Tony became opposition leader and ended that consensus, and the rest, as we all know, is history. Now I believe we've got to take the community with us to get a deep and lasting consensus, and if elected Prime Minister, then I will lead that debate to take the community with us. I'll work with some honest, decent Australians in our Citizens' Assembly to get the job done.
Look, I regret to say that there has been a complete failure of leadership from this government and from this Prime Minister. As you said, Chris, she said in November that delay is denial. She said last November that if you can't manage climate, you can't manage the future. Now the Prime Minister says that this is all too hard for our Parliament. It's got to be sent off to a glorified focus group. Well, we have a Citizen Assembly. It's called the Parliament of Australia. And if the Parliament of Australia can't make these decisions, what is democracy for? So look, I think that the Prime Minister should be very clear about where she stands and how she's going to get us there. And I think that the Prime Minister believes in a carbon price. Senator Brown wants a carbon tax. Thanks to the Green preference deal, there'll certainly be a Green balance of power in the Senate. We will get a carbon tax if this government is re-elected, as sure as night follows day.
And Julia Gillard joins us now live from Brisbane. Prime Minister, it's 7 weeks since you ousted Kevin Rudd as Labor leader, but a lot of voters are still very angry about the treatment of Kevin Rudd, and you haven't really convinced them that you are the better candidate this Saturday as PM.
Well, Saturday is all about a choice. It's about a choice between me and Mr Abbott for Prime Minister of this country.
No mention today or tonight, as a matter of fact, about the carbon tax. Have you decided that's going to cost you votes? Is that why it's on the shelf?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. What we will do is we will tackle the challenge of climate change. We've invested record amounts in solar and renewable technologies. Now I want to build the transmission lines that will bring that clean, green energy into the national electricity grid. I also want to make sure we have no more dirty coal-fired power stations. I want to make sure we're driving greener cars and working from greener buildings. I will be delivering those things and leading our national debate to reach a consensus about putting a cap on carbon pollution. There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Election 2010, Australia Decides, starts right now as we join Carl and Lisa live in the Canberra tally room.
That end of the Barnaby. Yeah, look, I came to the panel prepared to feel upset. I had thought there was an outside chance I'd feel elated, but the feeling we get is, in conclusion, it's still to go on. Some time ago there was a policy called an ETS. It got rid of a Liberal Party leader, got rid of a Labor Party leader, and looks like it might have got rid of the Labor Party. We have the capacity to put together a government. It will be precarious in the capacity to drive forward policy. What I do say is it is something that everybody has to conscientiously desire to have a stable government, not for a political party, not for themselves, but for this nation. If we don't have that, it's bad.
Mark?
A stunning performance by Tony Abbott. The thought of Julia Gillard being in a minority faction, leading a minority government with a minority Senate, is a recipe for disaster. And either way, I don't think Gillard is going to be around for a long time. She was very gracious tonight, a wonderful speech, 2 very good speeches, but I think either way it's the end of Gillard tonight. Even if she forms government, it won't be for a long time.
Tony Abbott is a big winner. He got the leadership by 1 vote. We looked like we were about to lose 20 seats, and we've won 14 or 15. The loser was Julia Gillard. She's taken her party into a minority, and the other huge winner is Bob Brown. Labor only got to that position on Bob Brown's votes, and as of tonight, Bob Brown is probably almost as powerful in his hold over the Labor Party as Julia Gillard.
I have to pay tribute to Tony Abbott. I mean, when he became leader 8 months ago, The coalition was fractured, the Liberal Party was fractured, they were dead meat. And tonight he's on the verge of forming a government. I mean, that is an incredible effort, and he ran a very disciplined campaign.
For the Liberal faithful, this is the sweetest stalemate of all. They believe Australia's about to get its third Prime Minister in 2 months.
I say that the coalition is back in business.
Tony Abbott warned against premature triumphalism, but sounded triumphant nonetheless.
The Labor Party has definitely lost its majority. And what that means is that the government has lost its legitimacy.
There can be no doubt now things have changed post-election. A joint news conference with the Greens for the big new drive for a price on carbon.
When you put a price on carbon pollution, you create an incentive so that less pollution is generated.
Climate Change Minister Greg Combet will play a lead role, but the Prime Minister herself is the chair. Green Senator Christine Milne is a deputy chair and independent Tony Windsor is a member.
The unifying cause at the outset here has been establishing a carbon price.
Chief advisor is Professor Ross Garnaut, along with 3 other experts. Their deliberations will be confidential, but they'll run public forums. Not impressed, the opposition.
This is a secret committee with a preordained outcome. It is repugnant for that reason.
The reaction anticipated, but the Prime Minister is pushing ahead with a formal invitation.
My call to Tony Abbott today, not to continue to play the role of wrecker.
The committee's been given till the end of 2011, but its work could be substantially done before then. The Greens will have the balance of power in the Senate from next July, and 4 of the 6 independents in the lower house are sympathetic to a carbon price.
I have dedicated my political life, whatever's left of it, to stopping this carbon tax. If it comes in, to taking it off and resisting till the death this thing coming in. So, you know, such political future as I have got rests entirely on beating this tax. Beating it in the Parliament if I can, but beating it in the electorate if I can't beat it in the Parliament. So that's the whole purpose of what's left of my political life, to do this.
Just days before the election, Julia Gillard made her position very clear.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
That was then, this is now.
We have to get on with the job of pricing carbon.
This is the greatest betrayal, the greatest breach of faith, that this is a world first. There is no other country anywhere on the face of the earth which is attempting to implement an economy-wide carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. This is a Labor Green carbon tax, and it's going to drive up prices, threaten jobs and do nothing at all for the environment. So I ask the question, what's the point of all of this? This is a redistribution pretending to be compensation. It's a tax increase pretending to be an environmental policy. It's socialism masquerading as environmentalism. That's what this is.
Her opponents pushing petrol prices to the front line in his fight against a carbon tax.
I'm the pump boy for the day.
Tony Abbott's drawn the battle lines in Western Sydney, talking up cost of living pressures.
As a result of the Prime Minister's carbon tax, their petrol is going to be more expensive.
The opposition says consumers will pay an extra 6 cents a litre.
The opposition leader now took the battle to Parliament.
I think that it's very important that the actors and the celebrities of this country should have their say. They should have their say. People who live in eco-mansions have a right to be heard. They really do. People who are worth $53 million have a right to be heard, but their voice should not be heard ahead of the voice of the ordinary working people of this country. Their voice should not be heard
ahead of the forgotten families of this country. And I say it is one of the fundamental principles of our democracy that everyone's voice is equal, and you do not give special weight to celebrities. You do not give special weight to people who live half the year in Hollywood where there is no carbon tax. Speaker, I am seeking to move a motion of censure in this Prime Minister, and she is fleeing the chamber. Let me repeat my motion that this House censures the Prime Minister for her failure to achieve anything of substance in 12 months of government after supplanting her predecessor on the basis that the government had lost its way, when it is clear on any assessment. This is a Prime Minister who, having been dishonest with her predecessor, was then utterly dishonest with the Australian people at the last election. She said that there would be a climate change people's convention. There's not. She said that there would be no carbon price until there was a deep and lasting consensus. There's not. She said notoriously, Mr Speaker, there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. And, Mr Speaker, having made that solemn commitment to the Australian people, what have we got? We have got a carbon tax. Mr Speaker, this has been the most incompetent, the most deceptive, the most dishonest government in modern Australian history. It used to be said, Mr Speaker, of the late American President, Richard Nixon, if he rubbed his nose, he was telling the truth. If he tugged his ears, he was telling the truth. But as soon as he opened his mouth, then you knew he was lying. And, Mr Speaker, that's the Prime Minister's problem. That's the problem with this Prime Minister. This suspension is necessary. It's necessary, Mr Speaker, to clean up the constant evasions and deceptions of this Prime Minister. She meant the minister at the table might tell us why he keeps calling the honest manufacturing industries of this country, the coal miners of this country, why does he keep calling them big polluters? Why does he defame and insult and denigrate the manufacturing companies of our country? Why doesn't he understand, as so many members sitting behind him understand, that these so-called big polluters are the big employers, the big exporters and the big innovators of our country? They are the people that we rely on for our standard of living, and they should not be destroyed by this government's carbon tax. You know, Mr Speaker, I want to quote something about something that this delusional Prime Minister said to the Australian people a week ago. Listen to this Prime Minister in full Napoleon mode. Faced with hurdles, I will always find a way through. Faced with choosing between taking a few knocks or doing what's best for the nation, I will put our nation first every time, no matter what the personal price. Well, Mr Speaker, why did this Prime Minister stand up and brazenly say to the Australian people 6 days before the last election, there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead? Was that a Prime Minister who always put our country first? Was that a Prime Minister who would take a few knocks for the people? Of course it wasn't, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we've seen quite a few different faces from this Prime Minister over the last little while. We've seen real Julia, we've seen fake Julia. We've seen wooden Julia, we've seen teary Julia. We've seen all the way with LBJ Julia. We've seen Bible expert Julia. We've seen George Washington, I will never tell a lie, Julia. The fact is, the one thing we've never seen, Mr Speaker, is truthful Julia. That's the one face of this Prime Minister we will never see, because, Mr Speaker, the one thing that she could not say to the Australian people 6 days before the last election was, yes, I will be honest and upfront with you, there will be a carbon tax under the government I lead. And that is the fundamental problem with everything this government does. This government is based on a lie. And what did we see today? Today we saw precious Julia, very precious Julia indeed.
Leader of the Opposition will refer to the members by their parliamentary titles.
Campaigning and complaining about a few nasty placards. Well, I tell you what, we never heard any complaints
from former Prime Minister John Howard when people like the Minister for Climate Change and the Assistant Treasurer fronted rallies before placards calling the former Prime Minister Satan and Hitler and baby killer. This is the kind of thing which the former Prime Minister had to put up, and members opposite did not utter the slightest word of apology.
Tony reckons if I get my ass into a saddle, I can't cause any problems. But just watch me, Tony.
Thank you very much. Isn't it great to see that you people here, you people are incredible. I feel so humbled that you've made the effort to come down here, to be part of your nation, to make the changes. It's only because you're here that we can do anything. So the first person I'd like to thank is you. Thank you so much. God bless you all for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, there are other people who don't have that choice. I remember last year talking to my mother-in-law about Meals on Wheels and hearing her say that, during winter in New England, it's easy to find where people are. Find places you find them in bed because they can't afford the power bill now. We don't need to make life any harder for them. If you want to provide something in this parliament, provide the dignity for the people to live with their birthright. Their birthright is cheap power. Their birthright is to have the essentials in life and for a government to provide it. But this government has gone off it, and the people who pay will be you. You will pay.
We are not going to change the climate from this building. We can make people poorer. We can definitely do that. I mean, how can they be so disconnected? How can they fool themselves in such a way as to honestly believe that the people out there is not a white-hot fury, that it's gone beyond the carbon tax, it's gone to a government that refuses to accept the right of the Australian people to say no.
And the thought that we would therefore engage in a gesture that is not going to cool the temperature of the globe but only make people who are doing it tough poorer is wrong.
Do you support the direct action plan of the coalition?
Well, I think the direct action plan is good because it's multifaceted, Fran. I mean, if you're increasing the productivity of soil, that's a good outcome. If you're inspiring greater technology that makes engines more efficient, that's a good outcome. If you're increasing people's standard of living, that's a good outcome. It's a good outcome on many levels. It makes vastly more sense than to say, I'm going to terrify you, and then I'm going to moralise to you, and then I'm going to bang a tax on you, and then I'm going to make you poorer, but nothing's going to happen to the climate. It's just that I'm going to be taking money out of your wallet, putting it into my wallet, and every time you dare argue with me, I'm going to say you're a denier or use some other pejorative to try and take the debate away from the reality of what is actually happening. That is nothing by reason of Australia's actions alone will change the climate. That is an absolute fact, that everything you do, every PowerPoint in your house becomes a collection revenue mechanism for the Australian Taxation Office. I don't think that's going to cool the planet.
Okay.
I just think it's going to make people very miserable, angry, and you've seen that in the polls, Fran. And the sooner the Labor Party wakes up and realises that the pejorative in the chamber is no excuse for the lack of votes on the street, then they might be able to get their own house back in order.
I refer the Minister to the Prime Minister's speech on the 23rd of July last year when she said that as a result of climate change, and I quote, the number of droughts could increase by up to 40% in eastern Australia. Can the Minister now confirm how many droughts will the government's carbon tax prevent?
The final vote in the Senate paves the way for the most comprehensive carbon price scheme outside Europe. It's a triumph for the Prime Minister.
Today, Australia has a price on carbon as the law of our land. This comes after a quarter of a century of scientific warnings, 37 parliamentary inquiries and years of bitter debate and division. Today, our nation has got this done.
The tax is aimed at making firms more energy efficient and encouraging more use of gas and renewable energy. But the outlook is uncertain. The government has a majority of just one. Many voters are hostile to the laws and the opposition has vowed to repeal them.
Julia Gillard's become the most unpopular Prime Minister since Paul Keating, according to the latest news poll.
In 1993, Paul Keating set a record low for a news poll approval rating, just a few months after what would be his first and last election win.
Well, I mean, these things go up and down all the time. I mean, it's early days of a long parliament.
Now Julia Gillard's almost equalled his low point, and she's also playing for time.
I believe that once carbon pricing is in place, people will see how the system works and the benefits of it. We're a long way from that. That's why I think we're in a tough period now.
Tony Abbott's now leading Julia Gillard in the preferred Prime Minister question in news poll, which until now had been her lone bright spot. The carbon tax has been the undoing of Labor this year, but Julia Gillard says it's a small price to pay to change the behaviour of carbon-emitting businesses.
They look at all the dollars and cents in their profit and loss statements and they'll see this item that says carbon pollution price and they'll go, how can I make that less? There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Well, certainly what we rejected is this hysterical allegation that somehow that we are moving towards a carbon tax from the Liberal and their advertising. We certainly reject that.
This Parliament has witnessed the unseemly spectacle of a government cheering itself for breaking its own election promise.
Why did you lie to us? Right, well, I can talk to you. And why are you continuing to lie and say, well, you know, I didn't really mean to lie. But the thing that sticks in my craw is you stood up and said there will be no carbon tax. And I was talking. And a few months later...
It's the biggest issue in Australian politics, bringing thousands to rallies to protest.
It's a great big green day for Australia.
And we know who is running this government when it comes to this policy. It isn't the Prime Minister, it is Bob Brown.
I make that crystal clear. We're not talking about changing it, we're talking about scrapping it.
The carbon tax modelling is a fraud. The carbon tax modelling is a con. The government's compensation package based on the carbon tax modelling is simply wrong, it's simply a rip-off, and the Prime Minister should come into this House, own up to that fact and start telling the truth for the first time since before the last election.
On the question of when the election will be on the 14th of September, and let me say very clearly to the Leader of the Opposition, it will be a contest, counterintuitive to those believing in gender stereotypes, but a contest between a strong, feisty woman and a policy-weak man, and I'll win it. To be supported by a Finance Minister, another man in a blue tie. Women once again banished from the centre of Australia's political life. We don't want to live in an Australia where abortion again becomes the political plaything of men who think they know better.
Good morning.
Well, according to the Prime Minister, if the coalition's elected, abortion will become the plaything of male politicians and women will be banished from public life. What's your response to that?
This is yet another crude political ploy from a desperate Prime Minister who's leading a bitterly divided party, and she's clearly trying to distract attention from her own self-inflicted political woes. I think Australians deserve better than this from the top leadership in the country. Confecting false gender wars is not what we expect from a Prime Minister. We would expect a Prime Minister to seek to unite the country, not divide it through some false gender war. And I find it rather dispiriting to think she has to resort to this.
Julia Gillard has launched a fresh attack on Tony Abbott as she tries to defend herself against increasing Labor leadership speculation. She's raised the issue of abortion, echoing the famous speech when she accused Mr Abbott of being a misogynist.
The poll suggests she's now beyond help, but Julia Gillard is fighting back.
I am the best person to lead the Labor Party.
With a pointed message to those wanting her to step down for Kevin Rudd.
There's rumour mongering and speculation. It's wasted breath.
So how confident are you that you'll lead the Labor Party to the next election?
Completely.
So are there any circumstances under which you will not lead Labor to the next election?
No, there are not.
As Mr Rudd worked his electorate, posting video of himself on YouTube, ministers lined up to support Ms Gillard.
The party is supporting Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister of Australia.
The Prime Minister's done a terrific job under very difficult circumstances.
Julia Gillard will lead Labor to the election.
Will Julia Gillard be leading the Labor Party to the election? Absolutely.
Tony Abbott says voters have had a gutful.
Enough is enough. Really, enough is enough.
Julia Gillard's decided the best way to unite her party is to give them a common enemy to attack, Tony Abbott. This afternoon launching a new stinging attack, flicking the switch back to misogyny. The media weren't allowed in to hear Ms Gillard speak to Women for Gillard, a new group based on Women for Obama. But her office released these pictures after she delivered this pointed warning about an Abbott government.
We don't want to live in an Australia where abortion again becomes the political plaything of men who think they know better.
That's certain to reignite the gender wars and show people like Attorney General Mark Dreyfus who's really in charge.
Julia Gillard, yes.
Confusing times.
Labor's re-election hopes have taken another major hit in the opinion polls, with support at its lowest level in 10 months. Labor's primary vote has plunged to 29%, while the coalition is at its highest rating in nearly a year. If an election were held today, the coalition would win comfortably, leading the ALP 57 to 43% on a two-party preferred basis. Tony Abbott's approval rating remains steady on 43%, while Julia Gillard's has dropped to 37%.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to have you just speak to me like this. End of sentence.
I have seen enough of good people on both sides of this chamber to have some respect for the Labor Party. The Labor Party of which it was once said there was a light on the hill, working for the betterment of mankind, not just here but wherever we can lend a helping hand. That once great political party is now reduced to being a life support system, a political life support system for just one person, the current Prime Minister. Well, I say to the current Prime Minister, for your party's good, you should go. For your party's good, you should go. For our country's good, you should go. You should go. We are a great people. We are a great country. I very much fear that we can never reach our potential under this Prime Minister and this government. I think it's time to give the people a chance to choose the Prime Minister and to choose the government. On the 50th anniversary of the faceless men being photographed on the Daily Telegraph, I say, let's get rid of the faceless men. Let's have a new Prime Minister and a new government.
The Prime Minister was openly criticised during a tense meeting of Labor's caucus, but her leadership remains intact for now.
The Prime Minister arrives at Parliament to find MPs in a spin over this image of her splashed across newspapers.
We know that the Prime Minister is good at spinning a yarn, and now we have the photographic proof of it.
Julia Gillard defended the photo shoot in the latest edition of Women's Weekly, depicting her knitting a kangaroo for the royal baby.
I just thought it would be cute. It would be a cute project to work on.
Her media advisers quoted saying the opportunity was a no-brainer, despite Ms Gillard admitting it felt slightly absurd, and the image now serving as a visual metaphor for a government knitting itself in knots over the leadership issue.
Obviously there is a little bit of speculation. You might have seen it in the papers.
Speculation fuelled by yet another disastrous opinion poll. It shows of Labor's 47 most marginal seats, 33 will be lost under Ms Gillard, including 9 held by ministers. 35% of voters would be more likely to vote for the government if Kevin Rudd was in charge.
Tony Abbott is now more popular as leader among women voters
voters than Julia Gillard. The surprise result is revealed in an exclusive 7 News Reach-Tell poll just months after the Prime Minister labelled the opposition leader a misogynist.
It was the speech heard around the world.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not.
Seen as a rallying cry to women voters, and at first it seemed to work. A Nielsen poll a fortnight later showed a spike in support for Julia Gillard among women, 53% to Tony Abbott's 38%, and leading 48-42 among men. But the 7 News Reach-Tell poll taken last weekend shows that trend has now reversed. Tony Abbott now leads among women voters 52-48 and is way ahead 62-38 among men.
Is there, Bill Shorten, any question that Julia Gillard will be Prime Minister heading into the election?
No.
Will you review your support for her?
No.
Have you been asked to?
No.
Do you unequivocally and totally support this Prime Minister into the next election?
I do support this Prime Minister, and you know that words are important, so that is why I'm saying I support our Prime Minister.
Will you review your support for her?
No.
Real answer? Yes. I'm already discussing it.
Have you been asked to?
No.
Real answer? Absolutely. 2 days ago.
Do you believe there will be a leadership ballot before the election?
No. I believe that Kevin Rudd leading us to this election will provide Australians, my colleagues, and those who want to support the Labor Party with the best chance of Labor winning office after this election.
Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard has been defeated by Kevin Rudd, who will take over as leader of the Labour Party once again. Rudd won 57 votes to 45 in a leadership ballot of Labour lawmakers. The long and bitter rivalry between the two politicians might now come to an end, as the former Prime Minister has said she will leave politics.
As you would probably be aware by now, Kevin Rudd has been elected as leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. I congratulate Mr Rudd on his election. In view of his election, I have written to the Governor-General asking her to commission Rudd as Prime Minister of Australia. I will shortly leave from this Parliament to see the Governor-General on this matter. In accordance with the pledge I gave earlier today, I announced that I will not recontest the federal electorate of Lalor at the forthcoming federal election.
Julia Gillard's government has become increasingly unpopular, and party members believe that Kevin Rudd might be able to secure a win in the general election in September.
She departs the stage. History goes with her as our first female Prime Minister. She said the party must put its divisions behind it, but even just a slight hint of those divisions, she said that she had written to the Governor-General asking her to commission Rudd as the Prime Minister. Not Mr Rudd, not Kevin Rudd, simply Rudd. This has been a bruising, painful experience, and look at it tonight. 7 ministers have fallen. Julia Gillard, Craig Emerson, Peter Garrett. Those 3 will all leave Parliament at the next election. It's the end of it for them. 4 others have gone, but they will continue to pursue political careers. Wayne Swan, Joe Ludwig, Stephen Conroy and Greg Combey. Also bear in mind that those 2 key independents, Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, today also announced that they will not be contesting the next election.
So yet again, the power brokers of the Labor Party have changed the Prime Ministership of our country. And I want to say directly to the people of Australia, you deserve better than this. You deserve strong and stable government. But the only way you'll get strong and stable government is through an election, so that you, the people, and not the faceless men of the Labor Party, choose the Prime Minister and the government of our country.